what happened during press conferences. And, I think in Timor-Leste, like in many countries, even though the public officials pay lip service to freedom of the press, they don't really like it when it's practiced. They don't like being criticized. And so this is sort of another issue. And then some of us were chatting earlier about media development. There has been, Timor for a long time was sort of the world's precious project. And, it's had some positive results and some negative results. All of the NGOs and aid groups have made significant financial contributions, and they have certainly decreased the reliance of media on state funding. But the problem is that they've also sort of created this project mentality where everybody is busy. All of the best journalists have left journalism and are now working for NGOs. That's one problem. And another problem is that the NGOs aren't going to be there forever. In fact, a lot of them have left. And so everything kind of collapses when they go. It's not really sustainable. So Timor, it's a place that just breaks your heart because there's just been so much good-hearted interference that, to me, as an outsider, it looks like a very fragile ecosystem that's just kind of been destroyed by all of these well-meaning NGOs. And also, people don't know how to say no. Here comes USAID with a big grant, and this is what we want to do, and we'll give you all this money if you do this, and everybody says, yes, we want to do that. Even though, is that really the best thing to do? Maybe not. Or is that really what they want to do? Okay, here's this Salvador Suarez, who's the editor of one of the papers, with his new printing, well, it's actually his old printing press, but he's very proud of it because there are not very many printing presses in Dili. Okay, so now wrapping up the lessons I've learned. I think first of all, there's a much greater likelihood of press freedom when journalists themselves are organized. And I think that this is one reason that Indonesia has been such a success story. Because remember how I was talking about Tempo's banning? Well, all of those really powerful journalists from Tempo became very active in the pro-democracy movement. There were a lot of young people who were really angry, and they formed the Alliance of Independent Journalists. Well, the senior journalists were helping them. The senior journalists were saying, yes, we are behind you. We stand behind you. So there has been very powerful journalist associations in Indonesia working to come up with a better press law, working to have a really independent press council, and holding the government accountable for everything it does. And so I don't know how you recreate that situation in other places. I think in Malaysia, the senior mainstream journalists, their lives are just too comfortable. They got good jobs. Why rock the boat? Everything's pretty good. So it's just the online journalists who are active, but they are seen as kind of dangerous people. So it hasn't really happened in Malaysia, and I think one reason is that they don't really have, there's not a powerful journalist association that's saying, we want a better system. I also think, as I said before, that public understanding of press freedom is important. And again, I think Timor-Leste is a good example. All of the government officials, the elected officials, they are good people, they mean well, they love their country, they're happy to be independent from Indonesia, but they don't want to be criticized either. They don't really want media that is criticizing them, that is pointing out corruption, that is, being a big pain in the neck, like journalists should sometimes be. So there is not a culture in which the public really gets the idea, hey, this is important, this is for us, this is not just for journalists, this is for all of us. Without a sound legal environment, it's impossible to practice good journalism. And I think, this is what I get frustrated in the U.S. when people like, hope I'm not hurting anyone's feelings, but like Internews or ICFJ say things like, well, we really need to train those Indonesians how to report on the environment. They know how to report on the environment. The problem is, it's not safe, there's too much impunity, and their news organizations are afraid because they don't want to be sued. They don't want to have to take a big logging company. They don't want to have to spend years in court spending tons of money, for legal advice. It's also impossible to keep secrets in an age of new media. And if I were advising the Cambodian government, and certainly no one has asked me my opinion about this, but if I were to give them advice, I would say, be more open. There is no point in being so secretive because people find out, people know, and instead we're having these weird discourses on Facebook rather than an actual political discussion between people who think this and people who think that. And I'm willing to say that there are plenty of good people in this government that would, are doing a fine job, but they need to say what they're doing. That the secrecy is just not really working, I've talked to so many students and they're all saying, how do we know what's reliable? Well, first of all, you need a government that's more open. So you can't keep secrets anyway, so there's no point in trying. And finally, the values of good journalism matter. This is why nobody reads the mainstream media in Malaysia anymore, and Malaysia Kini is very popular, and as are its imitators, the Malaysia Today, the Malay Mail Online. There are plenty of online publications now which practice really good journalism. They are trustworthy. They're the ones that people go to. So that is the end of my sermon, my speech. I'm very passionate about this. I love journalism, and I'm really happy to be here, and I'd love to hear what you think, your comments, any questions anybody has. Thank you for your attention. I do appreciate it. This is my email address, by the way, if anyone would like to contact me. So, I don't know, I'm curious what you think. I know we have so many people here with such wonderful experiences. Comments or?
Janet,
yes, sir. Can you say who you are and what you do?
I'm a researcher from CMAC. I work for and also a lawyer actually.
Oh, okay.
If you have to put your assessment of Cambodia, it's compared to these three countries, where would Cambodia stand?
Well, because this is my very last talk during my 1 week of talks, and as far as I know, we have no government officials here. I would say Cambodia strikes me as very similar to Malaysia in terms of control by the government through sort of ownership of publications. And the thing that has struck me, I should explain, this week I've been very lucky. I've been, I'm not a spokesman for the U.S. Embassy. I'm completely independent. These are my views. I hope I don't embarrass them. But my friend Reetha set up some wonderful talks for me with students. I've been to a bunch of different universities, a bunch of different news organizations. The thing that I keep hearing, well, two things. First of all, people want to know, young people want to know, who do we believe? How do we know who to believe? How do we decide how do we know what's reliable? Well, usually I'll then turn it back and say, well, how do you know? How do you know? And they actually know. They say, well, we look at the source, who's paying for it. We look at what this person has said. We look at if there are different views in the same story. So people know how, but there's still this kind of sense of there's so much information, what do we believe? The other thing that I keep hearing that strikes me as very interesting is the idea that if you are not pro-government, you must be pro-opposition. That there seems that the idea is that if you're independent, somehow that means you are pro-opposition. And this is the problem Malaysia Kini has had, that they report critically on the opposition too, but their enemies say, oh, well, you are just pro-opposition media. So I think trying to kind of educate people that, being independent means that you report critically on the government, absolutely. You report critically on the opposition, absolutely. You report critically on any new parties that show up. That you have an independent stance. This is part of your professionalism. You are not owned by anybody. So in that regard, I think it's more similar to Malaysia. I mean, that's what do you think?
Yeah, probably right.
Yeah.
I only speak based on personal experience.
Yeah.
But again here, I mean, my observation, even though we don't have media that's owned by those type of folks, but before you get the license, or you need to be aligned with certain
Right.
certain political line.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Well, that's certainly my sense that Suharto's control was very heavy-handed. I don't see heavy-handed control here, but I see control nevertheless, you know, and a lot of it is sort of self-censorship and people just assuming that they know what the owners are going to want, so that's what they do.
would that be, I mean, look at the United States where you have this Democratic aligned media and Republican aligned media as well. And what's your take on that?
Well, those actually, it's sometimes I think our worst, the United States' two worst exports are Fox News, which you all know about, and Baywatch, which you have to be of a certain age to know. Baywatch is the bane of all American women who travel around the world. And everyone assumes we're happy to just whip off our clothes and, you know, jump in the water in our bikinis. Fox News is a really bad example of American journalism. Sadly, it's the one everybody knows the best. Yes, and Fox doesn't even pretend to be neutral. I think most American news organizations actually strive to be neutral. But unfortunately, we don't really read them here, you know, that people don't really know about them. That, I personally believe it's impossible for us as human beings to be objective, but I think that the discipline of journalism is verification, and I think we can have an objective process, even if we as human beings are, you know, we all are shaped by our own values and what Walter Lippmann called the pictures in our heads. Most American media are not aligned with a political party. They really aren't. Now, they certainly have other problems, and I'm a big critic of American media. But as I keep telling young people here, the problems in American journalism are the fault of American journalists, not the fault of our government, because our government really does not interfere. Fox News, their problems are not because of the government. Their problems are because they're, in my view, unprofessional. The other thing I tell young people, and I feel very strongly about this, is that journalists, every country I have ever been in, journalists know what good journalism is. Journalists know. They know what a good story is. They know, they just know. They're often not free to practice it. But in my perfect world, journalists should regulate themselves. They should be the ones running the press council. They should be the ones involved in drafting the press law. We don't want to give that power to any government body, no matter how good they say they are, because maybe they're good now, but who knows what they're going to be in 10 years. That we just don't want the government regulating the work of journalists. The journalists know how to regulate themselves. So that's why I love this, to me, the success story of Indonesia, that's what's happened. And it isn't perfect, and they've still got to clean up corruption, which is unbelievable, and related to the legal system. But in terms of journalists themselves saying, you know, we want to enforce our own standards and just let us do it. It's happened there.
Today in Cambodia, the opposition plan to establish a new TV.
I know, it's interesting.
And I want to ask you about that. What would you say to the state when the opposition have own a TV kind of counter to the TV aligned to the government, and what will it be? Will we go to the journalism, or
well, it will certainly be interesting if they can do it, but the thing is, I think that, again, in my perfect world, a journalist that works for the government is not independent. A journalist that works for the opposition is not independent. In my perfect world, we want journalists who are not obligated to anybody, that are able to exercise their own professional news judgment without having to say, well, we only are going to report news in such a way that the opposition likes it. I don't see that as being fundamentally any better than what we have now. It does mean there'd be 2 points of view, and I guess that's good, but I think the Cambodian people deserve better than that, you know? But it would be interesting. However, I would say journalistic independence is better than working for a party. That there are not very many party papers in the world anymore. There really aren't. That was something that was big in the early 19th century, but really the model has been to move away from that. I mean, I know of one party paper in Malaysia, the Islamic party paper, and I actually studied them. And then, while I was just in Vietnam, I gave some talks at the Vietnam News Agency, which was very interesting. I'm the first American speaker they've ever had, and I was right under a big picture of Ho Chi Minh and a banner that read, "Long live the glorious Communist Party." And the interesting thing was that all the journalists there were so ready for change. You know, they were just so ready for change. And they know who they work for, and they know what they have to do and what they can't do. But I have no doubt that the moment things open up in Vietnam, those journalists are ready to go. They are smart, they are educated, they understand professionalism, they just can't do it. You had a question?
I have a question about
Sure.
the independent media as a tool for democracy. You mentioned that you spoke to students during this week. Did you talk to students who were studying journalism? Because it's not something that exists here, I don't think. I don't think we've got a school of journalism. And if young people wanted to become involved in that, they would probably do an internship with some of the major
Right.
newspapers. What is the case in the situation with 3 countries yet that you mentioned? Because this is a very powerful way
Absolutely.
to build up the capacity of young people who learn how to do
Right.
that, whether it's an Indonesian novel or a Portuguese or
I agree with you completely, and you are right. I think that I didn't go to any departments of journalism. There are communication departments. There is one department of journalism, right?
We are integrated at BC.
And I went there the last time I was here, right? But you're right. They study communication, whatever that means. I'm not really interpersonal, business communication, all these things. Actually, you know, this is just my impression. I don't know I'd like to know what you think. The news organization I was the most impressed with was Tame, the online publication. And, you know, we had what really was a very good little class of the young journalists there. They have in-house training. And I think that seems to be the tradition here, which is good if the in-house training is good. Your question is great. In Indonesia, there was never any real tradition of journalism training, but there was the Dr. Sutomo Press Institute. The idea was that bright young people who studied economics or history or animal husbandry or engineering would go to the Dr. Sutomo Press Institute, have an intensive 3-month course, and then get a job with a news organization. Tempo would train its own people, and I actually think it's quite excellent. Now, the American Embassy is always saying, oh, we need to have like American-style journalism schools. And I'm always saying, why? The system they've got works pretty well. Let's see if we can, you know, help that, make it better. Why try to impose what works in the U.S. in a place where they've never done this? Malaysia, they actually have journalism programs, but they're just awful. And what because the same ministries that control the news also control education. And the last thing they want is to have critical thinking among journalists. So it's worse than depressing to go to a journalism program where they're not really studying. I don't know what they're studying. They're studying, you know, theories of mass communication, which are perfectly fine, but not really relevant. East Timor, when I worked for the UNDP, the idea was to help create a training institute. And so I kept saying, well, let's try to do what has worked in the region. Let's try to create something like the Dr. Sutomo Press Institute, where, in fact, those teachers are pretty good. So yes, it's a huge problem. But I actually think one strength of Cambodian journalism is the backgrounds. I'm not a big believer in journalism education. In terms of like a 4-year undergraduate training in journalism. Nobody needs 4 years to learn to write. I mean, you need a couple months. I believe that actually having a background in law, a background in economics, a background in art, a background in whatever is better. And even in the US, when a really smart kid comes to me and says, I want to be a journalist, should I major in your department? I bring them in, shut the door and say, you know, take some of our classes, get an internship, but for heaven's sake, study something else so you actually know something about the world and, you know, you can get an internship. You don't need 4 years of. This is why I'm not a big fan of, a lot of American universities would like to set up programs in developing countries, and I'm sure Cambodia is on everyone's radar screen for like a big school of journalism here, but I don't think that's necessary. I think better to strengthen the institutions that are already here. So anyway, this is a great question. So you had a question?
Time is almost gone.
Okay, great. Yes.
What was the role of foreign language media in these countries?
Ooh, that's a good question. Indonesia, very little. They had. We were talking about this earlier. How Cambodia seems very unusual that there are these strong English language publications that the government doesn't seem to mind operating. None of the other countries I'm involved with would ever say that. Indonesia had the Jakarta Post, but it could be more open than the Indonesian language press because nobody could read it. You know, the government. Suharto didn't care about what a few elites who could read English thought. He cared about the masses. So he let the Jakarta Post get away with things that the other publications couldn't. But it would, the Phnom Penh Post, I always forget the other names, they're really good. I mean, they do real reporting here. I don't know how they get away with it. This is a weird thing to me about Cambodia, this sort of welcome to NGOs. Malaysia, absolutely not. They don't give foreign publications that kind of opportunity. In fact, that's seen as dangerous interference, you know. So East Timor, they just want the money, you know. Yes, please come and create your own newspaper and we'll all work for you. Which is then really bad because then you leave and we're out of a job and we've completely ruined the local publications that were depending on us. So it's, Cambodia is very interesting in this idea of welcoming expertise from foreigners. I mean, you all are the experts on Cambodia. This to me seems completely contradictory. That, yeah, you're smiling back there.
I think you haven't reached the critical mass of those able to think and analyze this language. So probably look at maybe 10,000 people that really read novels. And if the tuk-tuk driver can read, then probably that will change.
And you know, I have not met one student, and I am not exaggerating. Every class I go to, I say, how many of you read newspapers? I haven't met one student who reads newspapers. So in some ways, it doesn't really matter what the Khmer language press is doing, what the English, that's just not how they get their news. Which is interesting because it's not something, I also talked to the Club of Cambodian Journalists, and they don't seem to be quite aware of this, just how irrelevant they are for young people. You know, that this is a very interesting situation. We have this in the US too, but it's still, it's not quite like this. This kind of, we were talking about this in terms of the tribunal, the fact that young people just seem to live in a completely different world than even people in their 30s and 40s live in. It's interesting. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
It has been rumored that the government is drafting the internet law. And if this is true, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
What do you think I think about that?
Another question is, what will happen when the government shuts down the social media like Facebook?
You know, it's funny. Today with, I guess it was the University of Cambodia, a political science class, which was great. Gosh, those kids are smart. And you know, I feel bad I can't speak Khmer at all, but their English was great. They had really good questions. And you know, they were asking the same thing. And you know, I said, first of all, all of you guys are publishers. You all have Facebook accounts. I'm sure you have, 3,000 friends. You make postings every day. You share stories. You are curators of media. So you actually are kind of opinion leaders. You can influence your friends, and you make decisions about what's good, what's reliable, and what is trash. And you can be an opinion leader. But we were also talking about how even on Facebook, if one of my friends posts something that is obscene, that is threatening, that is, is terrorism, I can report it to Facebook. Facebook is a company, right? They have their own policies. They actually, one of my colleagues studies this, that it's interesting to think about social media and companies like Google and Facebook they're not connected to governments. So actually Facebook already regulates content. The Cambodian government is going to do what? They're going to regulate political content? Again, it's my last meeting, so I'm just going to say this. To me, it just seems absurd that there's a big discussion over a map, that this is treasonous to have this map on Facebook. For heaven's sakes, if you want to have a discussion about the map, that is absolutely great. But to say we need a cyber law and we need to arrest people because of something they're posting on Facebook, this seems like something that in a few years I hope Cambodia looks back at and says, boy, that was a really unusual moment in our history when that happened. Facebook, Facebook regulates Facebook. I think if you're regulating political speech on Facebook, well then that's a big problem. I have, believe it or not, a couple of conservative friends that are always posting, things that I completely disagree with. If I were the Prime Minister, I would not say, yes, and I'm going to arrest you for this. This is the way, if you are a stable and secure government, you don't mind this kind of criticism. That's the issue. I know I sound like an American. Yes?
There is another problem with the country, media country that do in authoritarianism. But when journalism try to promote democracy, but they themselves do in authoritarian style, like through by one or prepare everything, this news to be published. So what do you see about that?
I'm sorry, I think the sound in this room is a little strange. I didn't quite hear what your question is, that when journalists promote democracy...
Yes, some institutions, they do in media institutions, they do in authoritarian style, like boss decide everything.
Like what?
Boss decide everything. What you even they independence from government, but they do in authoritarian style.
So what's the question?
I'm sorry, I still didn't
What is the
hear.
question?
Your lecture has been trying to promote that journalism can promote democracy.
Right, yes, I do think that.
But sometimes some institutions of media, they are independent from government, but they do in authoritarian style.
Like what?
Authoritarian.
The media rule in an authoritarian style? Like what? What is the example?
The boss, they can decide what you
The organization itself is not run in a democratic style. Yeah, I guess that could certainly happen. Well, one thing that I feel is really important. I always try to tell young people, you have to work. You have to be true to your own conscience. If you have an authoritarian boss who's telling you to do things you don't want, you need to find another job. No journalist should ever have to do something they don't want, that they think is wrong. And I'm trying to think of a pro-democracy yet authoritarian boss journalist, and I'm sure there's some out there. Or that maybe they don't run a very good institution, a very good democratic institution. Well, then you should quit and get a different job, would be my advice.
what if all the that time?
What if what?
Or if many institutions do like that?
Well, that would be bad, but I don't really know of one thing that's interesting that's happened in Malaysia. Okay, the mainstream media, if you work for them, you make a lot more money. It's a much more comfortable life. But there's all of the young people who work for online media, they switch jobs all the time. And it's quite interesting. I think there's a real flexibility among them. They no longer feel they have to work for the same media house their whole career. So I think I wouldn't, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting scenario. What do you do if you have a bunch of media organizations that are run in an undemocratic way, yet promote democracy? Well, they would be big hypocrites. Yeah, that would be a problem. Yes, you in the back.
I have one
Sure.
simple question.
Yeah.
I'm from Media and Communication Department from UPPs, and my question is that what is the role of journalists? Only to inform or to educate people or to show what's right or wrong? Because some journalists they try to show what's right or what's wrong, but some people they only say that journalists should only inform.
I see what I know what you're saying.
My lecture that from Germany they said in Germany we only inform people, but some US journalists they said we have to educate and we have to show people what is right or wrong. And what I see in the media now is like they seem to promote the right as wrong. So what do you think?
Well, I think actually promoting right and wrong, that sounds like the work of NGOs and of advocacy groups. That I think most good journalists are not involved in advocacy. In my university, in my department, we train journalists, students study either journalism and mass communication, or they study political communication. If they are interested in advocacy, if they want to promote things, they usually study political communication, because then they learn how to, promote right and wrong and, change the world. Journalists are usually a different sort of person who wants to report fairly and honestly on what's happening. If your job is to change the world, if your goal is to change the world, you probably don't want to be a journalist, because journalists are supposed to be reporting on what's happening in society. They are not supposed to be advocating certain positions, which is actually my problem if we have pro-opposition television, then they are promoting a position. One other thing, when I first went to Indonesia and I met all of these ex-tempo journalists, people who had worked for that news magazine, I said, well, you were really practicing a kind of advocacy, weren't you? And they got really mad, and one of them said, no, absolutely not. That it's only because the system was so corrupted, that what we were doing looked like advocacy. All we were doing was just trying to present a fair picture of what was going on in Indonesia. But of course, for Suharto, it looked like, yes, these are dangerous advocates of change. So, in a way, I'm disagreeing with your assumption. I think that, again, in my perfect world, journalists should strive to be neutral, to represent all of society, to present the government view, the opposition view, any other view that comes along. They shouldn't be an advocate for they shouldn't be trying to promote anything. But that's the job for NGOs and for lawyers, all other kinds of advocacy groups. Does that make sense?
Journalists, they need to have one as people.
They need to do what?
They need to speak to the one as I mean, the journalists, one of their role, they are told and they are tasked to promote people that don't have much voice in.
Well, that's true, to give voice to the voiceless. But that's part of representing society in a comprehensive way, in a proportional way, saying, yes, minorities, religious minorities, people who don't have access to media, we need to make sure that they have a voice. But that's different than saying, we will be their advocates. If you want to be their advocates, you start an NGO and say, yes, I'm advocating for the native people of wherever. But if you're a journalist, you just need to make sure that they are being reported on, their activities are being reported on in a proportional way.
Two last questions, please. We have time for two last questions.
Okay, yeah, we have two hands up, so
I'm just out of curiosity.
go ahead, you first.
Yes, I want to ask you that in Cambodia, I see don't have democracy, and now you show the democracy with media. So how important that you show this, because in the government of Cambodia don't respect law, don't give the freedom to journalism. You have a solution?
Well, that
Solution.
we'll have a solution. Oh gosh. I have to say that my solution is looking at the faces of those really smart young students that I've been meeting. I just can't tell you how impressed I was with these young people. And I see the change now from even 2 years ago. They are asking better questions. They are, you know, they don't love this government, but they're also skeptical about the opposition. They want change. They want things to be better. And that's, you know, Cambodia has to figure out its future. But I have a lot of faith in the young people I've met. I really do. I feel completely energized by the young people I've met. And I think you and all of your friends are going to figure out what to do. That it would, you know, you don't want to ask me what I think you should do. I'm from a different place. But I think it's going to happen. I can see it happening already. I really can. And our final question from our Canadian friend who's
It's not a final question, but you touched very briefly on what you felt, or there were some problems with the American paper. Could you very briefly say what you think the biggest problems are?
Oh golly, that's an enormous topic. The whole economic basis of the American news industry has collapsed. That advertiser, I mean, it was based, our system, I mean, let's say, the Cambodian system is subsidized by the government and parties that are close to the government. You know, these tycoons are not making money on these newspapers, they're subsidizing them, they're paying for them. In America, it's advertisers that traditionally paid for the news in order to get access to us, the readers. Well, that model has collapsed because now advertisers can go directly to readers through direct marketing, through, you know, Craigslist, through Facebook, through Yahoo. They can completely bypass the news organizations. So who is paying for news? And this is a big problem. My brother, who's an editor in Tampa, Tampa, Florida, I said to him, how many people do you have covering the state government in Tallahassee? You know, Florida's this big state in the United States. You know what he said? He said, we are sharing one stringer with the paper in Sarasota.